Let's learn in this video how to create a disaster recovery plan for AKS cluster using Terraform and Velero. Velero is an open source tool developed by VMware used to create backups for Kubernetes cluster that include YAML manifest files and persistent volumes. Those could be Azure Disk and also the Azure file shares. All of this data will be backed up inside a storage account that can live inside another Azure region. So that will protect my AKS cluster against failures that can happen inside the data center, the availability zone, the location, or the entire region. Then that backup could be used to be restored into another AKS cluster that can live inside another Azure region. In this demonstration, we'll be using the AKS Landing Zone Accelerator GitHub repository, where we'll find all the Terraform files and all the YAML files for this demo. So in this demo, typically we'll go to create two clusters. First, AKS cluster, that's going to be my main cluster, and then a second cluster in order to simulate a disaster recovery, where, for example, if for any reason I lose the first cluster, I'll be able to restore my backup into the second cluster. And then we'll create a storage account to save the backup into that storage account. So we'll configure Velero, or actually we'll install Velero inside the first cluster, and then we'll go to configure it to point to that storage account in order to save all the backup for the disks and for the file shares and the manifest files coming from Kubernetes. It will be saved into that storage account. And then from the second cluster, it can also point to that storage account to retrieve or to restore that backup and make the second cluster my main cluster. So let's see how this works. So mainly here we have all the instructions, all the commands needed in order to run this demo. So you need to create a service principal. So make sure you are owner of the subscription that you want to use for the test. And then we'll go to deploy the Terraform template that will provision all the infrastructure for this demo. And then we'll configure we'll go to configure Velero in order to create a backup and then to restore that backup into a disaster recovery cluster. So let's first explore here the Terraform files that will create this infrastructure. So here we have the AKS one, that's, let's say, our main Kubernetes cluster here, where we have a creation of a Kubernetes cluster inside a resource group and then configuration of that cluster. And then we have the disaster recovery cluster, the DRAKS. And then we have other resources like the backup location. This is where we go to create the storage account where to save the backups coming from Velero. And then we have here, we are using a module for Velero. So we are exposing Velero as a Terraform module. So of course you can use Velero with the command line. It has its own command line, but you can also install it using Helm chart or YAML manifest files or using Terraform. And that's the choice made in this demo right here. So in the Velero cube.tf right here, I have the configuration for Velero. So that's gonna use the Kubernetes provider for Terraform to create a namespace, create a secret, create that element chart release using a dynamic set of variables that are described inside the locals velero.tf file. That one will use the required parameters to run Velero inside my cluster. So it requires subscription ID, resource group, where to save the data, the tenant ID, client ID, and the client secret for my service principal, and then some of the other parameters used by Velero. So we have here one of these parameters is the frequency of the scheduler. So each night at 23 at 11 p.m. it will go to provision or to create a new backup and push that backup into the storage account. And we have here the version of the Velero plugin for Microsoft Azure. Here we are using 1.4.1. Make sure to update that once you have a new update. And then the image tag of Velero and some other multiple options available right here. So to install this Velero, we need to point to the AKS cluster. So for that, here we have in the data file, we have some data that we need, like the Velero and the resource group, and then the storage account and the name of the clusters that we should point to. And then because we are deploying using Elm and Kubernetes providers, so we should add those two providers into our list of providers for Terraform. And then coming back to the main.tf file, where here we are orchestrating all of these deployments. So here we put the clusters for the main cluster, the DR cluster, the resource groups for Velero, and then creating the required resources, like here the service principal that we'll see in a second. That service principal will be used by Velero in order to get authenticated and authorized to read data from the AKS, but also to be able to push those backups into the storage account. So it should have the right access to airbag mode into the storage account. And then here we have the role assignments that should be assigned for Velero service principal and for the backup storage and so on. And then here, because we are using Velero as a module, so in this section we are describing what is the module to be used, its dependency, depends on the AKS cluster of course, and then the different providers use it and the parameters that we can pass to that module. So mentioning here the backup region, the backup region name, and then the name of the storage account, the name of the node resource group for the cluster, Velero namespace, where to install Velero inside my cluster, and then the name of the chart repository, chart version, and all the values that should be specified here, along also with the service principal. So to get this demo running, first of all, we need to go to clone that Git repository. Either you can take mine or you take the original one from the /Azure/AKS Landing Zone Accelerator. Then we go into the folder for the scenario backup restore. Then you log into your Azure subscription, get the Azure subscription ID, and then go to create a service principal that will be used by Velero. So for myself, I'm using AZAD create for airbag, a name of the service principal, given a role reader over my subscription ID. That's why I needed here the subscription ID, and then that will give me this service principal right here that contains the password. Of course, I should delete it right after this video. And then I have got to deploy the Terraform template. So first, using Terraform, you need to download and install all the providers, Azure RM Helm and Kubernetes and the random provider right here. Once that's done successfully, then I move to the next part, where here I go to plan the changes that will be made for by that Terraform template using the command terraform plan-out tf plan, and there Terraform will scan my configuration files. It will then check all the resources that will be created. So here we have actually lots of resources along with the install of Velero and so on. So if I look at the end right here, I can see we have 22 resources to be created. Let's take a look, a closer look to these resources that will be created. So if I use the command terraform show, then transform that tf plan into JSON, then filter resources from that JSON file, I'll find here the resources that will be created. So that's going to create service principal, or actually it will read the service principal password, then create the two clusters, and all the resources that we have discussed earlier. After that, if I go to apply that Terraform template using the command terraform apply tf plan, then here Terraform will go to provision all of that infrastructure for me, creating both clusters, creating the install of Velero, and so on. Then next here, if I go, now that the cluster is created, I can go to list the AKS clusters. So here I should find two clusters created, and that's what I should be able to see from my Azure subscription also. So we have one primary AKS cluster and one disaster recovery cluster. So I'll go to login into the first primary cluster using the command AKS get credentials, and then kube control get pods, and check here the pods for inside the Velero namespace. So you can see 3 pods, each pod installed on a node. So that's a demo state, and then you can see the controller for Velero, which is this pod running. So Velero was installed successfully in this AKS cluster. Next here, for the demo, we'll go to deploy an application. So we'll go to cd into the applications.samples file. So this is the folder right here that contains some sample deployments and some sample persistent volumes. So for this one, for example, it's using an Azure Disk CSI with local redundant storage. So it's creating a storage class that will use the standard SSD disk with LRS and using a CSI disk, and then creating a specific namespace to deploy a pod that will consume that volume or that disk, and then creating the persistent volume claim pointing to that disk with 1 gigabytes of size. And the same here, creating multiple types of storage or of PVCs. So from the disk with the CSI LRS, then creating another disk with ZRS. This one looks like the previous the previous file that I have showed. So this one is using standard SSD with ZRS as the SQ name. And then we are also using Azure files. So this Azure file is using ZRS. So we can see that configuration. You can know it's an Azure file because here the provisioner is a file.csi.azure.com. And then here we are creating a service persistent volume claim PVC to consume that file share. And then again creating another file share with LRS instead of ZRS. So we want to see those different scenarios, and finishing with creating a stateful set where here we are consuming another PVC. So here I cd into that folder, and then I'll go to apply all of these YAML files into my primary cluster. Once that's deployed, it will deploy all of these resources for me. So once these resources are deployed, it will go to deploy the pods and also deploy the file shares inside the storage accounts, and then deploy the persistent volume claims or the Azure disks inside the managed cluster or inside the node resource group for my AKS primary cluster. So next, if I go to kube control get pods from all the namespaces, I will find my 5 pods running right here, and each pod is running successfully and it have its own volume attached successfully. I can of course get those volumes also from the kube control command line. If I do kube control get PVC from all the namespaces, I find the 5 volumes right here. So now these volumes are empty. There is no data there. So let's try to create some data files inside these volumes. So first of all, we start with the first one. So we'll go to use kube control exec into the pod, and then from within that pod, we'll run the command touch. And we create a new file, call it some data file.txt. It's just a file, it's empty, but the file will be there. And then we'll do the same for all the other volumes. So we want to create an empty file into all these volumes. So we are executing inside the pods for all the other deployments. Once that's done, now we want to check that data was created successfully, or that those files are created successfully. So we'll go to exec into the pods again, and then we'll run ls to list the data from these files. So we'll ls there, and here it tells me, yeah, the file exists in all of these persisted volumes. And then next we'll go to use Velero. So here we should make sure that we have Velero installed in our machine. So for myself here, I installed it from the Git repo. I'm running 1.8 of Velero. And then here to create the backup using Velero. So we have two options. Either we do that automatically, so we can configure Velero through the command line or through Kubernetes manifest files to say I want to create a regular backup each midnight, for example, or I can also use the command line. And here I have used the command line to create a manual backup, a backup called manual backup 1 using the command Velero backup create. And then here I have waited a little bit to create that backup, and once that backup is created, I can now describe that backup showing the details right here. So if I view these details, it will show me all the objects that were backed up into my Azure storage account. So all of these resources were backed up, and until where I reach the end of this file. So multiple objects actually were backed up. That's a good one because we have included all the namespaces and all the objects. And by the way, of course, you can filter on namespace or on specific types of objects. And for the Ristic backups here, it did back it up all our 5 storage providers. So here's the Azure disk and the file shares and so on. And we can also, by the way, get those list of get that configuration of the backup from the kubectl command line by using kubectl get backup from all the namespaces. And here we find our manual backup one. So let's say now that we have a problem in that cluster. Either that cluster failed, or we have our application failing, or we have a disaster happening in that region, or on that location, or in that availability zone, and we wanna restore our applications into another cluster, another AKS cluster. That's gonna be our secondary cluster. So this secondary cluster could be in the same region as the first one or in another region. Typically, you want to backup into another region. That region will be for today the same region as your storage account. So make sure when you choose the region for your storage account to create the backup, make sure it's the same region as your AKS cluster. So when we go to restore right here, we'll go first to log in into the secondary AKS cluster for the DR cluster, and then we'll get all the pods to make sure that Velero was installed successfully. Remember here we have installed Velero into both clusters. Okay, so we have it here installed inside the second cluster. Once that's done successfully, now we can go to say Velero backup get. So to check the backups available for that second cluster, and here we can see that manual backup is now visible for that second cluster. So with that, we can go to restore from backup. So we can see this backup because in the second cluster we have installed Velero, but we are using also that service principal in that second cluster to access the storage account. So from there we can issue the restore from the backup inside that storage account. So before starting that, let's go to take a look at the storage account. So here, if I go back to my Azure subscription, go to the storage account that were created by the Terraform template right here, and then if I go to containers, I should find here a container called Velero, which contains two folders, or actually 3 folders now. So backups, Ristic, and restores. So let's go to backups. So this will contain our manual backup one with all the objects that were backed up here, like the Velero backup, the name of the backups, and so on. And then we have a Ristic folder here that contains the files, the system files for the different volumes that were restored. So we can find here our CSI disk file shares with the ZRS and LRS and so on. And next, if I go to restores, so here within restore one, we should find the logs that were collected from my restored applications. So now from there, I can go to say start the backup using Velero command line. So Velero restore create, and then restore one from backup. I'm gonna refer to the manual backup one. And once that backup have succeeded, then I can go to check if that backup did really succeeded. So here I go to check pods from all the namespaces, and I can see the new pods are popped up here into my secondary AKS cluster through Velero. So I can view more information about that restore by running Velero restore get restore the name of my restore one, and they can see that restore were completed in this date right here, and they can also run the command describe to get more details about this backup. So we can find all the CRDs and all the objects that were restored as part of this backup, along with the disks and the file shares. What I can also do is that I can view the logs that were created during the backup to see if we have some issues or some errors or some warnings there. And at the end, so now after restoring those volumes, let's make sure that we have that data or those text files let's make sure they still on those volumes. So here, if I go to run kubectl exec into the pod and then list the text file, there I will find the text file is restored successfully into my disk. And I do the same for the other disks, the file shares and the other file shares, and yeah, successfully you can see all of that data now were successfully restored into the DR AKS cluster. And so now if I go to the node resource group for the DR AKS cluster, I can see here the 2 storage accounts that are hosting the file shares, and I can see the 3 disks that were restored using Velero. I hope this demo was helpful for you. Thank you.